pretty amazing when you think about it,
Yeah.
Everything we do, like every little thing, blinking or, making a big decision, it all comes from biology. And for all of you listening out there, especially those of you prepping for the MCAT and getting ready to be doctors, getting the biological foundations of behavior down isn't just about acing the test. It's about really understanding what makes us human, like the basic mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about going beyond just memorizing terms and actually getting how these things all work together to create the behaviors we see. That kind of deep understanding is going to be super valuable, both for the MCAT and when you're actually practicing medicine.
Right, exactly. So today we're diving deep into, you guessed it, the biological underpinnings of behavior. And we're going to cover it all. We're talking electrical signals, chemical signals whizzing through our nervous systems, the huge influence of hormones, even those tricky genes, and how they play a part. And to help us navigate this super complex world, we have a leading expert in behavioral neuroscience, Dr. Jordan Carter. Welcome back.
Glad to be here. It's a really important area, and as we go through it, you'll see how these biological factors are always interacting to shape our actions and reactions.
Okay, let's get started. Dr. Carter, let's start with the nervous system, like the body's command center. How does this giant network work so that we can actually, interact with the world?
It's like a super complex communication network, think central hub, and tons of connecting pathways. The nervous system is basically split into two parts. First, you have the central nervous system, that's the CNS, the brain and spinal cord. That's where all the processing and control happens. Then, branching out from the CNS, there's the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, and that's all the nerves going everywhere else in your body. They're like information highways carrying signals back and forth to the CNS.
Okay, so central command and the lines of communication. Got it. Can you give us a really clear example of the CNS and PNS working together, something we can all relate to?
Okay, picture this. You touch a hot stove. Ouch, right? Sensory neurons in your skin, those are part of the PNS. They pick up on that heat instantly and they shoot a signal to your spinal cord. And here's the crazy part. The spinal cord is so fast, it doesn't even wait for that signal to get all the way to your brain before reacting. It just goes, nope, and triggers motor neurons, also in the PNS, to send a signal back to your arm muscles, like get your hand off that stove. It's super quick, a total reflex, all to protect you. And then only after your hand is safe, that initial signal finally makes it to your brain, and you actually feel the heat and pain. It shows how the PNS can jump into action based on input from the CNS, even down at the spinal cord level, before you even consciously realize what's happening.
Wow, so the spinal cord kind of goes rogue there. That's so cool how efficient the system is. So what about more complex stuff, everyday things, that require more thinking and planning?
Yeah.
How do the CNS and PNS work together then?
When things get more complicated, the brain, which is in the CNS, takes charge. It analyzes information and tells the PNS what to do. Okay, imagine you're driving in rush hour. Your eyes, which are part of the PNS, are taking in all this visual info about the cars around you, how fast they're going, how close they are, what they're doing, and sending it to your brain. And your brain, it's processing all this visual data, comparing it to what you know about traffic laws, your past driving experiences, where you're trying to go. And based on all that, your brain decides, okay, brake now, or speed up, or change lanes. And then it sends those decisions as signals through motor neurons in the PNS to your muscles, the ones that control the steering wheel, the pedals, all that. So you can actually do what you need to do while driving. It's this constant loop, sensory input, brain processing, action.
Okay, that makes it really clear how these two systems are working together every second of the day. Let's zoom in even more now to how signals actually travel between those individual nerve cells. So neurotransmitters, right? Those are involved.
Yeah.
What are those chemical messengers exactly?
Exactly right. Neurotransmitters are the signals, the chemical signals that allow neurons to talk to each other. They're molecules released from the end of one neuron, which we call the presynaptic neuron, into this tiny gap called the synapse. When an electrical signal, it's called an action potential, reaches the end of that presynaptic neuron, it's like release the neurotransmitters. They go spilling out into that synaptic cleft. Then they float across the synapse and bind to special receptor proteins on the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron. And that binding can do one of two things. It can excite the postsynaptic neuron, making it more likely to fire its own electrical signal, or it can inhibit it, making it less likely to fire.
So it's like a key fitting into a lock on the next neuron, either switching it on or off.
Perfect analogy. And all these chemical interactions, that's the foundation of all the complex processing that happens in our brains. Neurotransmitters control a crazy amount of functions. Everything from our mood and emotions to how we learn and remember, how we move, even basic things like sleep and how hungry we feel. Take dopamine, for example. What's really interesting about dopamine is its role in motivation and the brain's reward system. When we experience something pleasurable, like eating a delicious meal or achieving a goal we've been working towards or having a good time with friends, dopamine is released in certain brain pathways. And that reinforces those behaviors that led to that reward. It makes us want to do them again.
Right. And we hear a lot about dopamine imbalances being linked to certain medical conditions, too.
That's a really important point. When dopamine levels get messed up, it can be a big deal for our health. For example, in Parkinson's disease, there's a big loss of dopamine-producing neurons in certain brain regions. And that leads to those movement problems like tremors and difficulty moving. On the other hand, too much dopamine activity in other brain pathways has been linked to some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. These connections really show how important that delicate balance in our neurochemistry is for us to function properly.
Wow, so these tiny chemical signals can have such a huge impact on our health and behavior. You were talking about the reward system and dopamine. Can you explain how neurotransmitters might be involved in addiction? I know that's something a lot of future doctors will have to deal with.
Addiction is a great example of how those neurochemical processes can really control behavior and decision-making. Lots of addictive substances, like drugs and alcohol, work by messing with dopamine levels in the brain's reward pathways, especially the mesolimbic pathway. They cause this huge surge of pleasure, and the brain learns to connect that with the substance. But with repeated use, the brain's natural dopamine system can get all out of whack. It might start producing less dopamine on its own, and the person needs more and more of the substance to get that same initial high, that their tolerance builds up. And that, combined with the intense craving for that artificial dopamine boost, really drives the cycle of addiction and makes it so hard to quit. It's like those external substances hijack our brain's natural reward system.
That makes a lot of sense, putting a biological lens on something that can seem like it's just a behavioral problem. Okay, before we get into the different parts of the brain, we had a quick true or false question for our listeners. It was, neurotransmitter imbalances have no impact on mental health. Dr. Carter, what's the answer, and why is it important for our listeners to understand this?
That statement is definitely false. Like we were just talking about with dopamine and Parkinson's and schizophrenia, and as you'll learn throughout med school, neurotransmitter imbalances are at the heart of many mental health disorders. For example, serotonin, that's another key neurotransmitter, it regulates mood. And when serotonin levels are disrupted, it's often linked to things like depression and anxiety. Another one is GABA, which is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. Imbalances in GABA activity are thought to contribute to anxiety disorders as well. Understanding this stuff, the neurochemical basis of these conditions, is super important for future physicians because you'll be diagnosing and treating people who are directly affected by these systems.
Yeah, that really highlights why it's so important to really get these concepts down early on. Okay, let's shift gears. We've talked about neurons and neurotransmitters, but now let's look at the brain itself, the bigger picture. How is the brain organized into different regions? And what do those regions do?
The brain might look like one big thing, but it's actually made up of distinct regions, and each one specializes in different functions. A good way to think about it is in three main divisions, based on how they evolved and where they're located: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. It's like a layered structure where the hindbrain is the oldest part, evolutionarily speaking. It takes care of our basic survival functions. And then the forebrain is the most recently evolved part, responsible for those more complex, higher-level cognitive abilities.
Okay, let's start at the bottom with the hindbrain. What are the key structures in there, and what are their main jobs?
The hindbrain is at the base of the brain, connecting to the spinal cord. It's mainly in charge of our fundamental life-sustaining functions, the autonomic stuff. That includes things like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and our sleep-wake cycles, things we don't really have to think about. The hindbrain also houses the cerebellum, which is key for motor coordination, balance, and timing our movements precisely. Think about walking, standing upright, riding a bike. Even those really intricate hand movements, the cerebellum makes sure all those actions are smooth, coordinated, and accurate.
So the hindbrain keeps us alive and moving smoothly. What about the midbrain? What does that do?
The midbrain is above the hindbrain, below the forebrain. It's like a relay station for sensory and motor information. It plays a big part in processing auditory and visual info and controlling eye movements. What's really interesting from a behavioral standpoint is how the midbrain's involved in those automatic reactions to sensory stimuli. For example, let's say you're walking and suddenly, bam, you hear this loud noise. Your midbrain helps you quickly turn your attention to that sound and react. You might jump or flinch even before you consciously realize what the sound is. It's all about those super fast automatic reactions to changes around us.
Right, those quick, almost instinctual reactions can be really important for safety. And now we're at the forebrain. I know this is the largest and most complex part of the human brain. What are the important structures here, and what are they responsible for?
The forebrain is definitely the most developed and complex region, and it's responsible for those higher level cognitive functions that make us human, like conscious thought, decision making, problem solving, language, memory, and how we regulate emotions. There are several key structures in the forebrain. The cerebrum, which is the biggest part, is divided into two hemispheres, and it's involved in most of our higher cognitive functions. Then there's the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the cerebrum, and that's involved in everything from how we sense things to how we move voluntarily to complex thought processes. Also in the forebrain is the limbic system, which is a network of structures that's super important for processing emotions and forming memories. Key parts of the limbic system include the amygdala, which processes emotions like fear and pleasure, and the hippocampus, which is essential for forming new memories. And finally, we have the prefrontal cortex right at the front of the forebrain, behind your forehead. This area is especially important for executive functions. That's things like planning, reasoning, working memory, impulse control, and being able to understand consequences. It's like the control center that helps us manage our behavior and make decisions to reach our goals.
So when we're facing a tough choice, like whether to take a secure job that maybe doesn't make us happy, or one that's more exciting but maybe not as stable, which part of the forebrain is working hard to figure that out?
That kind of decision making is a classic example of the prefrontal cortex in action. It can weigh those long-term goals and future consequences, consider abstract things like happiness and fulfillment alongside concrete factors like money, and stop us from making impulsive decisions based on what we want right now. While the limbic system would be involved too, adding in your emotional response to each option, how each path feels, the prefrontal cortex is the part that's trying to be rational, analyzing the different scenarios and making a careful choice. It's essentially trying to figure out what the long-term impact on your overall well-being will be.
Okay, that makes sense. It's amazing how these different brain regions work together to produce our behavior and guide our decisions. Let's move on to another system that's crucial for influencing behavior, the endocrine system. How does this system work with the body and affect our actions?
The endocrine system is different from the nervous system. The nervous system uses fast electrical and chemical signals between cells, while the endocrine system relies on hormones. They're chemical messengers produced by glands and released into the bloodstream. These hormones travel throughout the body and can reach various organs and tissues, including the brain. They can have big and long-lasting effects on physiological processes and, as a result, on behavior. So while neurotransmitters act quickly and locally across synapses, hormones can have a more global and sustained impact.
Can you give us some examples of specific hormones and how they can affect our behavior and overall well-being?
Of course. Cortisol is a good example. It's a steroid hormone released by the adrenal glands when we're stressed. When you're in a stressful situation, your body sets off a chain reaction that leads to cortisol being released, and that helps you deal with the stress. It mobilizes energy reserves, increases alertness, and suppresses bodily functions that aren't immediately necessary for survival. But if you're exposed to high levels of cortisol for a long time, which can happen with chronic stress, it can have negative effects on your mood, sleep, immune function, and even cognitive abilities like memory and concentration.
Right, we hear a lot about the negative effects of stress on both physical and mental health. What about hormones that have more positive associations with our behavior and social interactions?
Oxytocin's a great example of that. It's produced primarily in the hypothalamus and released by the pituitary gland. It's often called the love hormone or the bonding hormone because it's really important for social bonding, trust, attachment, and feelings of well-being. Oxytocin levels tend to increase during things like physical affection, social interaction, and childbirth. It's amazing how one hormone can be involved in so many fundamental parts of our social lives.
You mentioned childbirth. Can you tell us more about oxytocin's role in that and how it affects behavior afterward?
Absolutely. During labor and delivery, oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions. But it does more than that. That surge of oxytocin released during childbirth also helps create a strong bond between the mother and newborn. And oxytocin is also released during breastfeeding, where it helps with milk letdown. But at the same time, it strengthens those maternal bonding behaviors and feelings of care and protectiveness towards the baby. It's a great example of how a biological mechanism, the release of a hormone, serves an essential physiological function and contributes to those basic social and emotional connections.
It's amazing how our biology and behavior are so intertwined. Okay, we have another quick quiz question for our listeners. Which hormone is known as the love hormone and also plays a key role in childbirth and bonding? Is it A, cortisol, B, testosterone, C, oxytocin, or D, estrogen?
The correct answer is C, oxytocin. It's key for those important social and maternal infant bonds that are so essential for development and well-being.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about behavioral genetics. How much of our behavior is determined by our genes?
This is an area that's often misunderstood. It's important to remember that genes rarely directly cause specific behaviors. Instead, our genes can influence our predispositions, our temperaments, and whether we're more vulnerable to certain conditions that might then affect our behavior. For example, genes can contribute to differences in how anxious we tend to be, certain personality traits, and even how likely we are to develop a substance use disorder.
So it's more about tendencies or increased risks, not like a predetermined fate.
Exactly. And that's where the environment comes in. Our genes provide the blueprint, but how that blueprint is expressed depends a lot on our experiences, how we were raised, our social interactions, and our overall environment. It's the interplay between our genes, our nature, and the environment, our nurture, that ultimately shapes our behavior.
Can you give us a real-world example of how genes and environment work together to shape behavior?
Let's say we have identical twins. They have almost the same genes, right? But let's imagine one twin grows up in a stable, loving home with very little stress and lots of social support. And the other twin experiences a lot of trauma, neglect, or chronic stress during childhood. They might end up with very different behavioral patterns and even have different risks for developing certain mental health conditions later in life. Even though they started with the same genetic predispositions, those drastically different environments can lead to very different outcomes. This shows that genes can increase vulnerability, but the environment can either protect us or trigger those vulnerabilities to actually show up in our behavior.
That really shows how complex the whole nature versus nurture thing is. It's more of a back and forth than one or the other. Let's talk about how our brains, and therefore our behaviors, evolve and change as we age. What are some key stages of development that are especially relevant?
Brain development is a process that never stops. It starts really early, before we're even born, and continues well into adulthood. During prenatal development, especially in the embryonic stage, the brain grows super fast and all the structures start to form. It's amazing to think that at this stage, new neurons are being created at a rate of over 1,000 per minute. This rapid growth and movement of neurons lays the foundation for the whole nervous system.
1,000 new neurons per minute. That's incredible. What are some big behavioral changes we see in early childhood that reflect all that brain growth?
In early childhood, we see really rapid development in motor skills. Think about a baby going from barely being able to control their movements to being able to roll over, sit up, crawl, and then walk. These milestones show that the neural pathways in the brain that control and coordinate muscle movements are maturing. Language development also takes off during these early years, which shows how quickly the brain regions involved in understanding and producing speech are growing and specializing.
What about the teenage years? We hear a lot about the teenage brain. What's going on in the brain during adolescence that might explain some of the behavior we see?
Adolescence is a time of major brain reorganization and refinement, especially in the prefrontal cortex. That's the part in the front, remember, that's super important for planning, impulse control, decision-making, and understanding consequences. While the brain reaches its full size pretty early in adolescence, the connections in the prefrontal cortex keep developing and getting more efficient throughout adolescence and into early adulthood. And that ongoing maturation is thought to be a big reason why teenagers often do things like take more risks, act impulsively, and rely more on their emotions when making decisions. Their brains are still developing the ability to consistently weigh long-term consequences and control impulses in the same way adults can. Think about things like speeding or other risky behaviors. A teenager's prefrontal cortex isn't quite there yet in terms of being able to override those immediate desires with a solid understanding of what could happen.
That's a really helpful way to understand some of the challenges and characteristics of adolescence from a biological perspective. Okay, we have one last quiz question for this section. When does the prefrontal cortex usually fully mature? Is it A, childhood, B, adolescence, C, early adulthood, or D, late adulthood?
The answer is C, early adulthood. This extended period of development really highlights how important the prefrontal cortex is for shaping our higher-level cognitive and behavioral control as we mature.
That's been a great overview of how our biological underpinnings change throughout life, Dr. Carter. Let's quickly recap everything we've talked about today for our listeners, especially with the MCAT in mind.
All right, so here are some of the key takeaways. We talked about how the nervous system is organized into the CNS and PNS and how they work together to process information and generate responses. We dug into the role of neurotransmitters as those chemical messengers that let neurons talk to each other, influencing things like mood, movement, and reward. We looked at the major brain regions, the hindbrain for basic survival functions, the midbrain for sensory processing, and the forebrain with its complex structures like the limbic system and prefrontal cortex for higher-level cognition and emotion. We discussed the endocrine system and how hormones like cortisol and oxytocin have those widespread and long-lasting effects on our bodies and brains, influencing stress responses and social bonding. We touched on behavioral genetics and how our genes and environment interact to shape our behavior. And finally, we highlighted the major stages of brain development across the lifespan, from that fast prenatal growth to the long maturation of the prefrontal cortex in early adulthood.
That's a great summary. And for our listeners who are prepping for the MCAT and getting ready to be physicians, understanding this stuff, the biological foundations of behavior is absolutely crucial. It gives you a basic framework for understanding not only typical human behavior, but also what causes the different psychological and neurological conditions you'll see in your practice.
Exactly. This knowledge is going to be so valuable as you think critically about the biological factors that contribute to health and disease, make accurate diagnoses, and come up with effective and compassionate treatment strategies. Always remember that both genetics and environment play a role in how your future patients are doing.
Dr. Carter, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. This deep dive into the biological foundations of behavior has been so informative, and I know our listeners are going to find it incredibly helpful for their MCAT prep and beyond. We hope this has given everyone a clearer and more complete understanding of this super important topic. In our next deep dive, we'll be exploring motivation, emotion, and stress, so be sure to tune in for that.
It was my pleasure. I'm looking forward to the next one.
As you continue studying, I want you to think about how all those biological systems we talked about are interconnected. How could a genetic predisposition for a certain condition interact with early childhood experiences and hormone changes during adolescence to eventually lead to a patient's symptoms or behavior? Being able to think about the biological basis of behavior in this kind of integrated, holistic way is going to be so important as you move forward in your medical careers. It will help you provide truly informed and compassionate care.